In April 1924, a frozen lake in central Oregon began to thaw. What rose to the surface ended a 3-month search, but it did not answer the most important question. Who had come to the remote cabin at Lava Lake, and why had 3 experienced outdoorsmen apparently trusted that person enough to step outside unprepared? The story begins in the Cascade Mountains west of Bend, Oregon, where winter could turn a short journey into days of travel. In 1923, a logging contractor named Ed Logan owned a small cabin and a fox farm near Little Lava Lake. He hired Edward Ed Nichols to remain there through the winter, care for 5 valuable foxes, and work the surrounding trap lines. Nichols was 53, an experienced blacksmith, logger, trapper, and horsepacker. 2 friends joined him. Roy Wilson was 36, a former Marine and logger. Dewey Morris was 24 and also worked in the timber industry. Together, the 3 men planned to spend the winter of 1923 and 1924 in the high country. The arrangement was difficult, but it could be profitable. Once snow closed the roads, the cabin was reachable mainly by snowshoe. Depending on conditions, the trip could require many miles through deep snow. Inside the cabin, the men had food, equipment, and a stove. Outside, they maintained long trap lines through a landscape of timber, frozen water, and volcanic terrain. At first, everything appeared normal. Shortly before Christmas, Nichols traveled to Bend with a pack of furs. He told people that the season was going well. Morris and Wilson also appeared to have visited town around the holidays. Wilson told his mother that the men expected to return before Easter. By New Year's Day, all 3 were back at the cabin. On January 15, 1924, they received a visitor. Alan Wilcoxon, who was traveling on snowshoes toward his property at nearby Elk Lake, reached the cabin late in the day. He stayed overnight. According to later accounts, the men were comfortable, in good spirits, and pleased with their winter's work. The next morning, Wilcoxon continued toward Elk Lake. That was the last confirmed time the 3 trappers were seen alive. Weeks passed. No messages came from the cabin. Winter isolation made silence understandable, but as the season changed, concern grew. The men had families and friends in Bend. They were expected to return. By April, their absence could no longer be explained by weather alone. On April 13th, Roy Wilson's brother-in-law, H.D. Innes, and Dewey Morris's brother Owen made the difficult trip into the mountains. When they reached the cabin, they found no sign of the 3 men. The scene suggested that normal life had stopped without warning. A meal had been left behind. Food remained on the cold stove. The calendar had not been turned beyond January. Winter coats, hats, firearms, and trapping equipment were still inside. The cabin appeared to have been searched or disturbed, but investigators found no clear sign of a struggle within its walls. The 5 foxes were gone from their pen. The trappers' furs were missing. So were 2 hauling sleds. Innes and Morris returned to Bend and brought help. Over the following days, relatives, local volunteers, and Deputy Sheriff Clarence Adams searched the trap lines, nearby cabins, and the snow-covered country around the lakes. The abandoned traps told their own story. They had not been checked for a long time. Whatever had happened, the men had not simply extended their route or become delayed on ordinary work. Searchers eventually found the foxes near the cabin. Some had been skinned with greater skill than others. This difference led investigators to consider the possibility that more than one person had been involved. Then the search moved toward Big Lava Lake, a short distance from the cabin. Near the shore, one of the missing sleds was discovered. Tests reported at the time indicated that stains on it were human blood. A faint route across the frozen surface led toward a place where a hole had been cut into the ice and later frozen again. The searchers now believed they understood where the missing men had been taken. But the lake was deep, frozen and difficult to examine. Early newspaper reports warned that recovery might be impossible. Then, on April 23rd, the spring thaw broke apart enough ice to reveal what the winter had concealed. The three men were found in the lake. They were returned to Bend, where a coroner's inquest concluded that all three had been killed. The jury's final finding was careful and direct. The men had died at the hands of a person or persons unknown. That wording has never been replaced by a conviction. The timing was itself uncertain. Wilcoxon's departure on January 16 created the earliest clear boundary, while the sale of pelts in Portland on January 22 suggested that the cabin had been abandoned before then. Newspapers at the time published different estimates for the date of the killings, reflecting how little investigators could establish with confidence. Snow preserved some traces but erased others. Distance delayed the discovery for months. By the time a formal search began, weather, animals, and the spring thaw had altered the scene. Investigators were working without modern forensic laboratories, instant communication, or reliable transportation into the mountains. They had physical clues and witness memories, but no confirmed eyewitness to the final encounter. Every conclusion depended on connecting fragments, separated by miles and by nearly 3 months of silence. Investigators tried to reconstruct the final hours at the cabin. The men's coats remained inside. Their weapons had not been taken from their usual places. There was no confirmed evidence that they had prepared for a long journey. These details suggested that they may have gone outside briefly, perhaps in response to a familiar voice or an ordinary disturbance. That remains a theory, not a proven sequence. The evidence also pointed toward theft. The accumulated furs were gone. The valuable foxes had been removed from their pen. Within days of the likely time of the deaths, a man sold fox pelts to a Portland fur business and reportedly used Ed Nichols's trapping license as identification. Authorities focused on Charles Kimsey, also known by the alias Lee Collins. Kimsey knew the Lava Lake area. He had previously worked for Ed Logan and had trapped with Nichols. According to the Deschutes Historical Museum's account, Nichols and Kimsey had argued in 1923 after Nichols accused him of stealing money. Kimsey was also accused of burglarizing Logan's home. More seriously, Kimsey was wanted for an attack on a taxi driver named W.E. Harrison in August 1923. Harrison survived and later identified Kimsey as the man responsible. Kimsey disappeared, and his location during the winter of 1924 became a central question. After the Lava Lake discovery, Sheriff Samuel Roberts circulated a wanted notice. A Portland traffic officer and employees of the fur business believed the person connected to the January sale resembled Kimsey. Reports also described a second man carrying furs with him. But resemblance was not enough. Kimsey remained out of reach for nearly 9 years. In 1933, he was finally located in Montana and returned to Oregon. Investigators hoped witnesses in Portland could identify him as the man who had sold the furs. They could not do so with certainty. A Bend Bulletin report from April 3, 1933 stated that a police officer and 2 fur dealers failed to make a positive identification. They saw similarities, but 9 years had passed. Their uncertainty weakened the case that investigators had tried to build around the fur sale. Kimsey offered an alibi, claiming that he had been working on a railroad tunnel project in Colorado during January 1924. Records examined by Sheriff Claude McCauley reportedly showed that a man using Kimsey's alias had worked there, but had left on January 6th. Another witness said he had seen Kimsey traveling through Central Oregon later that month. The conflicting information raised suspicion, but it did not prove he had reached Lava Lake. Kimsey was never convicted of killing Nichols, Wilson, or Morris. He was instead tried for the 1923 attack and robbery of Harrison. Harrison identified him, and in April 1933, a jury found Kimsey guilty. A judge imposed a life sentence. Kimsey spent decades in prison, was eventually paroled, and died in 1976. For investigators who believed he was connected to Lava Lake, the result was incomplete. They had a possible motive, knowledge of the area, a prior conflict, and disputed witness recollections. They did not have a reliable identification, a confession, or evidence strong enough to establish guilt in court. The possibility of a second participant made the mystery even harder. Contemporary reports described two men with the furs. The uneven handling of the fox pelts also encouraged the theory that two people had been present. Yet no second person was ever legally established as an accomplice. Later writers have proposed names and theories, but the historical record does not provide a final answer. The official conclusion remains what the coroner's jury stated in 1924. The three trappers were killed by a person or persons unknown. Ed Nichols, Roy Wilson, and Dewey Morris were buried side by side in Greenwood Cemetery in Bend. Nearby geographic features later carried the name Three Trappers, preserving their memory in the landscape where they had worked. Today, Lava Lake is no longer as isolated as it was during the winter of 1924. Roads, recreation sites, and modern travel have changed the region, but the essential contradiction remains untouched. Three experienced outdoorsmen were secure in a stocked cabin. Their equipment was within reach. Their last visitor found them relaxed and content. Then, sometime after January 15th, the routine stopped. The calendar remained on January. The coats remained inside. The lake kept the rest until spring. And when the ice finally opened, it revealed what had happened to the three trappers, but not who had come to their cabin.